Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to say that I am flabbergasted beyond comprehension that Dropbox have given me such an immaculate opportunity to lecture here today on a number of different subjects or discipline I find quite intriguing or fascinating, to say the least. And also, I would like to thank Dropbox for giving me the opportunity to clear up a number of misconception, misperception, misapprehension, misconstrue ideas primarily neurotypical individuals have, or their perceptions of atypical individuals. When we say atypical, we refer to individuals who fall outside the spectrum of neurotypicals. That include mental disorder, spectrum disorders, chronic disorders. It includes high-functioning autism, Asperger's syndrome, borderline savants, weirdos, geeks, nerds, quirky individuals, eccentric individuals, and just individuals who fall outside the spectrum of what our proverbial term defined as normalism. So today's discussion is going to be centered around primarily mental disorder or mental diseases, specifically bipolar, because I find bipolar to be quite an intriguing mental phenomenon. Now, this lecture today wasn't actually centered around mental disorder. My initial objective was to come here and lecture about an algorithm. A couple months ago, I built an algorithm, which is a nonlinear, unorthodox algorithm. Basically, I published 27 chapters on a set of computational inputs. These set of computational inputs was a nonlinear or unorthodox approach to augmenting and modifying search engines' efficiency. Algorithms search engines efficiency primarily for 5 top major corporations. One is Google, the other is Yahoo, Microsoft, AOL, and also Apple. Technically, Apple doesn't actually have a search engine, but I was pitching the project for them as well. During a snippet of a dialogue with Mr. Nolan Silverman, one of the co-producers of Dropbox, he mentioned this sort of misapprehension about myself in the LA community. Hence, I found it imperative, if not paramount, to deviate or deviate from what I deemed initially to be my subservient objective to lecture on my algorithm, to get into something that has a little more practical implication and application, and that is neurotypicals or normal individuals' misconception, misperception, or misapprehension of individuals who fall outside the spectrum of what is perceived as normal. So today's lecture will be centered around mental disorder. Our primary focus is bipolar, and we're going to take a cross-disciplinary, a multidisciplinary, a transdisciplinary, and an interdisciplinary approach to mental disorder. So we are approaching mental disorder or mental diseases or spectrum or chronic disorder from quite a peculiar perspective. We're taking a transdisciplinary approach. Transdisciplinary is basically when mutually exclusive disciplines converges, right, to formulate a new conceptual idea, right? Multidisciplinary is when mutually exclusive disciplines converge. Cross-disciplinary studies is when you take an explanatory position of one discipline within the context of another. So we are approaching mental disorder from a cross-disciplinary, a multidisciplinary, and a transdisciplinary, and also an interdisciplinary perspective, which interdisciplinary falls within the category of where mutually exclusive disciplines sort of permeate each other to formulate new ideas or groundbreaking paradigms. So we're taking these approaches and we're exploring multiple disciplines simultaneously. We're looking at mental disorder from from a philosophical perspective. We're looking at mental disorders from a psychological perspective. We're looking at mental disorders from a physics perspective. We're looking at mental disorders from a musical perspective, from a musical theoretical perspective. And we're also going to explore mental disorders from a linguistic perspective. We're also going to take the parapsychological phenomenon into consideration. We're going to take a psychopathological analysis. We're also going to take a pathophysiological analysis. We're also going to study mental disorders from a neurological and a cognitive analysis. And last but not least, we are also going to explore the miscellaneous aspect of mental disorder, where we're going to take a number of different variables or variances into consideration. Now, before we get into all these details, this lecture is primarily going to be more of an introduction to mental disorder, because 1 hour is simply not enough time to encapsulate the multifaceted fascination and phenomenon of mental disorder. So let's dive into specifically what exactly is bipolar. You have different sorts of bipolar. You have bipolar 1, which is manic episodes. You have bipolar 2, which is hypomania. You have bipolar, the third bipolar, which is considered cyclothymia or cyclothymia. And then you have bipolar 4, which is atypical, which doesn't technically apply to any of the former. Bipolar 1 is emotional fluctuation. You have extreme polar extremities between emotions. So you're looking at euphoria and dysphoria. There's a sort of disparity between emotional states, and these emotional states are extremities. This is bipolar 1 manic episode. Bipolar 2 hypomania is a milder version of bipolar 1 manic episode, where you have these mood fluctuation between euphoria and dysphoria, but they're not as extreme. Then you have cyclothymia or cyclothymia, which is a milder version of bipolar, where the mood fluctuation tends to oscillate on a day-to-day basis. There's this high, rise, and fall, this sort of emotional fluctuation that occurs multiple times simultaneously on a day-to-day basis. Then you have atypical, which doesn't fall into any one of the categories. And then we go into areas like comorbid mental disorders, where there's multiple mental disorders that collide and converge simultaneously, where you end up in a predicament where one cancels out each other. A prime example is when high functioning autism meets bipolar 1 manic episode. One tend to cancel out each other, or there's some profound convergence occurs. That's beside the point. The whole point here is to explore what exactly causes bipolar. There's a whole dichotomic school of thought behind the evolution or the number of prerequisites or preconditions that sort of predicate bipolar. One is a biological predisposition, and there's also environmental factors that are conducive to what induces bipolar. Biological predisposition, meaning that it's genetically affiliated, or it's inherited in the family, or environmental factors in terms of substance abuse, a trauma, post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder, insomnia, because bipolar can be induced, or manic episode can be induced through insomnia, primarily if the circadian rhythm is disrupted. Circadian rhythm basically is a sleep moderator, right? And this works with the melatonin, which induces sleep when the sun sets below the horizon. This has to do with the relationship with the melatonin, your pineal gland, your circadian rhythm. When insomnia induced, this can and possibly induce manic episodes. There's a number of different variables that induces mania. Our objective here is not to study the epidemiology of mental disorder, but to try to put into perspective this sort of misconception, this misapprehension, or this misconstrued nature neurotypical individuals have of individuals who are perceived as abnormal, which is not really the case. Let's take We're going to explore 10 areas. We're going to take a philosophical approach. From a philosophical perspective, we're going to explore areas like existentialism, epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, phenomenology. We're going to explore ideas like solipsism, intersubjectivity, phenomenology. In fact, let's just get into it specifically. Before I get into these details, there's some things I need to clarify and put into perspective right now. This lecture is centered around a self-referential and empirical analysis only. I would like to reiterate. It is centered around a self-referential and empirical analysis only, which is based on subjective experience. This is not inferential, and this is not centered around any sort of theoretical analysis. Again, I repeat, it is self-referential and empirical analysis only. When bipolar goes into manic episode, two cases we are going to focus on primarily here is manic episodes and hypomania, because these are the two cases where you have polar extremities in mood fluctuation, from elation to dysphoria, right, that ascends right back up to euphoria. During manic episode, bipolar cases transcend into 5 emotional states. One is impulsivity, the other is distractibility, the third is disinhibition, the fourth is grandiosity, and the fifth one is pathological compulsion. You have impulsivity, you have distractibility, you have disinhibition, you have grandiosity, and you have pathological compulsion. Let's explain these 5 emotional phenomena that occurs during grandiosity. Impulsivity is an instantaneous reaction or decision make without any sort of foreknowledge. Impulsivity and intuition are often used interchangeably and out of context, but they are mutually exclusive. Clarification. Intuition is predicated on a sort of foreknowledge, a sort of foreknowing. Somewhere deep in your subconscious, you have a sort of precognitive, intuitive sense of knowing before an intuitive decision is made. With impulsivity, it's a decision that is sort of predicated on a sort of instantaneousness. That's impulsivity. Distractibility is self-explanatory. It is the inability to stay focused. And you have disinhibition. Disinhibition is when a manic is removed from cultural nurturing and social conditioning. Then we have grandiosity. Grandiosity, again, is self-explanatory. It is the augmentation of one's ambition. And then you have pathological compulsion. Pathological compulsion is an abnormal, constant pursuit. Now, we understand that these are the 5 emotional attributes that are induced during manic episodes. Now, we're going to take a transdisciplinary, a multidisciplinary, a cross-disciplinary, and an interdisciplinary approach to sort of circumvent a number of fascinating phenomena that occurs with mental disorders or mental disease or just atypical individuals as a collective group. Let's take the philosophical approach. We're going to discuss the philosophical, the psychological, the physics, the music. From a theoretical standpoint, we're going to explore also the linguistics, the parapsychological, the psychopathological, the pathophysiological, the neurocognitive, the neurological and the cognitive, and last but not least, the miscellaneous, where we'll explore a number of different variances. Let's explore the philosophical aspect of mental disorder. Let's talk about solipsism. Solipsism is one of those philosophical ideology that is predicated around the idea of only the mind that exists, and all external stimuli is predicated on some sort of mirrored projection, some sort of mirrored manifestation of projection, or some sort of imagination of some degree. Then you have the idea of intersubjectivity phenomenology. But before we get into intersubjectivity phenomenology, let's explore specifically different sorts of solipsism. One aspect of solipsism says that only the mind exists and other minds cease to exist. which is one of the flaws of solipsism. But then you have epistemological solipsism, which states that I cannot prove that other minds exist. Then you have the metaphysical solipsism, which states that I cannot prove with absolute certainty that other minds exist. Right? During manic episode, bipolar cases tend to adapt or integrate a sort of solipsistic sort of ideology, where their perception of reality become a sort of figment of their imagination, sort of predicated on the merits of the Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where she tumbled down this rabbit hole and she went into La La Land. But their philosophical ideology is not so much solipsistic, because solipsistic is somewhat an unfinished philosophy or a flawed philosophy, because it's a sort of selfish ideology where other minds don't exist. But when you take into account ideas like intersubjectivity phenomenology, where we're looking at minds as a collective group, or we're looking at collective consciousness, how do you, as a solipsist, invalidate that? This is one of the paradoxes of solipsism and intersubjectivity phenomenology, where if only one mind exists, how do you validate intersubjectivity, collective consciousness? Now, whether collective consciousness is objective or subjective is a whole different subject. This is one of the conundrums that bipolar cases are in during grandiosity, augmented ambition, where they believe they are God, they go into this solipsistic sort of phase, right? Then you have the existentialistic despair. Before we get into the existentialistic despair, there's three philosophical areas we need to explore quickly. One is nihilism. Nihilism postulates that the universe has no inherent or no intrinsic meaning, and trying to construct any meaning or value is pretty much useless. Or absurdism postulates the same sort of idea that the universe is meaningless, and trying to construct any meaning is sort of counterproductive or in contradiction to the intrinsic meaninglessness of the universe. Existentialism now postulates the same idea, but has something quite intriguing or far more optimistic to say. It says that based on free will and responsibility, that human beings have a moral obligation to take some sort of subjective responsibility for their construction or how they perceive reality. One idea of existentialism is the idea of existence precedes essence, or the idea of authenticity. Hence the reason I thought to put existentialism, absurdism, and nihilism under the same umbrella, because when manic episodes are going through euphoria, whenever they catapult back into dysphoria, they experience phenomena like you hear the pervasive term used in the medical community, existentialism despair, or existentialism crisis, which is partially the contrast of existentialism, where it kind of borderlines nihilism. Now, we've explored philosophy. We've only scraped the philosophical aspect of manic episode. Let's go into the psychological aspect. During mania, manics go into a phase of impulsivity and grandiosity. And things like cultural nurturing and social conditioning, they are sort of removed from this sort of perspective of reality. And this kind of opened them up to, and I always use the term that patterns in nature are undetectable to the unimpaired and uninitiated. I'm going to say this again. Patterns in nature are undetectable to the unimpaired and uninitiated. I'm going to say this one more time so viewers can ingrain this in their psyche. Patterns in nature are undetectable to the unimpaired and the uninitiated. What is that conducive to? What does that instigate? What does that postulate? That postulates that a level of impairment, meaning that you have to have some level of cognitive dysfunction, or you have to be uninitiated, you have to be initiated, you have to be impaired, and you have to be initiated to some degree to be exposed to a number of different phenomena that occurs in nature. We're going to get into that pretty soon. So we've explored the philosophical aspect of mental disorder. We've explored the psychological. Let's discuss the physics. Let's discuss the physics of mental disorder. Let's discuss sound, because there's two key areas that occur with manic episode. In fact, with mental disorder and mental disease as a whole, right? Things like apophenia, pareidolia, hallucination, psychosis, schizophrenia, they're all predicated on two senses. One is the sense of hearing and the one is the sense of visual. So let's talk about the physics of sound. Sound travels at 700 miles per hour. What causes sound? What is sound? Sound is a collision of air molecules. What causes sound? Sound is a very simple, basic physics phenomenon that propagates in nature. When there's an impact, the impact creates a vibration. This vibration creates a force. This force creates energy, and this energy travels at 700 miles per hour. It has amplitude, it has frequency, it has velocity, and it also has intensity. Intensity determines the distance at which the sound travels. Now, our interpretation of sound is a wave, but the reason why we interpret sound as a wave because sound is actually illustrated on a two-dimensional surface. But when you think about sound, sound is actually is sort of dispersed from a three-dimensional perspective, because it's sort of an expanding sphere or expanding bubble that just sort of propagates and disperses and dissipates depending on the impact that caused the intensity. So what is the relationship between the physics of sound and mental disorder? Sound travels at 700 miles per hour, but we can only hear between 20 to 20,000 hertz, right? Because we can only hear between 20 to 20,000 hertz, it means that our perception of frequencies are very limited. We have a very limited range of how we hear sound. The frequencies are limited. So we explore the philosophical aspect of mental disorder. We discussed the psychological aspect. We talked about the physics. Let's talk about the musical aspect of mental disorder, the theoretical aspect of music. We could go back to Pythagoras and the first chromatic scales, but we're going to talk specifically about the chromatic scales, or in fact, let's just go all the way to the diatonic scales. The diatonic scales is a number of notes that was extracted from the chromatic scales to form the musical structure in the Western Hemisphere. One of the biggest phenomena we have in music is something called octaves. Why do we hear octaves? Why, when you double a chord, or let's say primarily an A chord consists of 440 hertz, why when you double 440 hertz, you get an octave? So you hear the same note at a much higher frequency, but it's the same note. So it's the A, but a higher frequency. Now we call it pitch. It's frequency. From a physics perspective, it's called frequency. How we interpret sound, we call it pitch. Now, why are we hearing octaves? Octaves is quite a phenomenon. It turns out that based on our biological evolution, we and our Homo sapiens, our survival mechanism, was sort of contingent on pattern recognition. One aspect is our hearing. So we evolved to hear sound logarithmically. Logarithmically is basically when we interpret sound in increments. Logarithmically in terms of we don't really interpret sound from a linear perspective. We interpret sound non-linearly. And because we interpret sound non-linearly, this sort of isolates us from sound in two different perspectives. One, we are isolated in terms of the frequencies, the physics of frequencies. And two, we are isolated in terms of how we interpret this sound. Because when this sound, this collision of air molecules, which travels or propagates as mechanical waves, collides with your ear, it goes into your ear and your basilar or basilar membrane converts this and interprets this as octave. So we've established that there's a limitation in the frequencies of sound, and we've established that there's a limitation in terms of how we interpret sound. So we have explored the philosophical aspect, we've explored the psychology, We've explored some physics. We've discussed some musical aspect of mental disorder. Let's talk about the linguistics aspect of mental disorder, which is probably going to be the key highlight of this lecture. Linguistics have many subfields. You have phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, and psycholinguistics. Psycholinguistics is an intriguing phenomenon because in psycholinguistics, actually, let's bypass psycholinguistics. The philosophical aspect of linguistics is an intriguing phenomenon because it's one of those areas where we explore the arbitrariness of language. What is the relationship between the word or the lexicon cup and the physical attribute of the object itself? What is the relationship? There's a level of arbitrariness between the word and what the word defines of the object, right? We can remove the word cup and we could replace cup with spoon, and it will have the same interpretive attribute from a human perspective. So we have the subsets of linguistics: phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. We're going to talk about phonetics shortly. Phonetics has three subfields. One is articulatory phonetics, which deals with how sound is produced from the vocal cords. You have acoustic phonetics, which deals with how sound travels from the source to the observer. And you have auditory phonetics in terms of how sound is interpreted by the receiver. In phonology is intriguing because in phonology you have two different branches. You have segmental and suprasegmental features. Suprasegmental features, also known as prosody. Suprasegmental features, also known as prosody, explores areas like rhythm, pitch, meter, and actually intonation, inflection, cadence, and tonal modulation. So what does phonological features have to do with manic episode? When bipolar goes into mania, right, their tonality change. Their tonality change. One of the phenomenon in manic episodes is they go into this solipsistic / existentialistic mode. So they kind of become this authentic kind of being where impulsivity. This is quite a complex conundrum to put into perspective because during mania, the phonological features of a person with mania, their tonality change. If you deal with someone who with manic episode, you will notice that there's a sort of rapidity in their speech. You'll notice that their tonality sort of deviate from what is conventional to something that's a little more adolescent. And like I mentioned earlier, during mania, there's 5 emotional attributes that are prevalent during manic episode: impulsivity, distractibility, disinhibition, grandiosity, and pathological compulsion. During mania, they go into something called impulsivity. Studies have shown that impulsivity is far more prevalent amongst adolescents. During your teenage years, you are far more impulsive than when you are an adult. So during mania, something triggers a manic that they sort of recede back to their adolescent state. And not just recede back to their adolescent state, but they kind of take on a new sort of phonological features. That's why dealing with mania, you may find something intriguing, extraordinary, or remarkable with the way in which they convey information or the way in which they articulate themselves. Because the phonological features, it's almost as if through social nurturing and cultural conditioning, the phonological features of language become sort of integrated into human communication as part of the nurturing and conditioning. Because when manic becomes disinhibited, they are sort of removed from these conditionings, and they are also removed from these phonological nurturing features. And they become disinhibited, and they take on a new sort of language, a language that's prevalent among teenagers. Sometimes you'll meet someone with manic episode and you'll wonder why they're so childish. Why is he so childish? Why does he act like a child? It's a fascinating form of rhetoric because manics recede back to this sort of correlation between adolescence and impulsivity, which you find, studies have shown you find far more prevalent in teens. So we've explored two subsets of linguistics. We've explored phonetics, we've explored phonology. We have morphology, which we'll probably bypass, which is the breakdown of words into morpheme. Then we have syntax, which deals with context. Then we have semantics. Semantics is fascinating because semantics is where you explore all the ambiguity in language. Homonym, homophone, homograph, heteronym, heterograph, polysemy, monosemy, capitonym, paronym, hyphonym, meronym, holonym, and hyphonym. Then we have pragmatics, the way in which language is used. Then you have like psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, and the philosophical aspect of linguistics. We probably don't have much time to get into all these different branches in terms of how it relates to manic episodes. But let's go into one of my favorite areas I call parapsychology, the parapsychological aspect of manic episode, where you get into areas like psychokinesis, telekinesis, which is synonymous, which is the ability to move objects. Then we have telepathy, which is the ability to read mind. Then you have precognition, premonition, clairvoyance, and retrocognition. Precognition is a sort of foreknowledge. Premonition is a sort of forewarning. Clairvoyance is psychic ability. And retrocognition is the ability to see the past. Right? From a parapsychological perspective, all of these phenomenons or epiphenomenons are far more prevalent and integrated into bipolar manic episode during mania. And the real question here is, why do manic episodes have these sort of experiences that neurotypical or normal individuals don't actually have? Again, proceeding back to what I said initially, patterns in nature are undetectable to the unimpaired and uninitiated. During mania, what occurs is our perceived division of the subconscious and the conscious sort of effaces during mania. It becomes effaced, and manic episodes sort of germinate that sort of disparity. This is where we get into the phenomenological aspect of philosophy, which we explore a snippet of phenomenology that deals with the subconscious and the unconscious. Why do manic episodes germinate the subconscious and the conscious? And it turns out, and this is quite an intriguing phenomenon, and this has to do with the neurological and the cognitive aspect of mental disorder. Now, when we look at the neurological and the cognitive aspect of mental disorder, we have to get into stuff like brainwaves: alpha, beta, theta, delta, and gamma brainwaves. Let's explore what the 5 brainwaves entail. Delta brainwave is a brainwave oscillation that is induced when a person is in a deep sleep or deep meditation. Theta or theta brainwave is one wave above that deep sleep. It also induces meditation. Alpha brainwave is when you're up and you're fully functioning, but you're stress-free, and you remove from social anxiety, and you have no depressions whatsoever. Beta is the brain fluctuation that everyone navigates through life at, because at beta is where you go through life dealing with all your stress, your turmoil, your personal, your banal, trivial, and mediocre issues. And gamma radiation is considered the highest of cognitive human function. Basically, that is where it entails cognitive tasks that requires a number of different information processing. During manic episode, their brain oscillations are in alpha and gamma. It is not in beta. It is not in beta. And studies have shown that when your brain is in the alpha state, it is far more effective than when it is in the beta, delta, theta, or gamma. Now, we're going to explore another fascinating area. And this fascinating area is something what we call the Earth's electromagnetic radiation. The Earth's electromagnetic radiation, or the Earth's electromagnetic pulse, or the Earth's heartbeat, is basically an electromagnetic radiation that exists between the Earth's cavity and the ionosphere. And this electromagnetic radiation spans at least 300 miles from the Earth to the ionosphere, right? Studies have shown that this radiation oscillates around the same frequency of the alpha brain waves. So when a person is in a state of peace and serenity and tranquility, they are in an alpha brain state. And during mania, they are in an alpha and gamma brain state. And they sort of germinate the subconscious and the conscious because they are removed from cultural nurturing and social conditioning. And because of this predicament, they are exposed to a number of different phenomena. Like I said initially, patterns in nature are undetectable to the unimpaired and uninitiated. What are they exposed to? More patterns in nature. Stuff like apophenia, pareidolia, hallucination, delusions, psychosis, and schizophrenia. And it's not that they are seeing more in patterns in nature. It is because their sense of awareness have actually been heightened or been augmented, which is quite an intriguing phenomenon. So what they experience is stuff like synchronicity and serendipity and stuff like precognition. One prime example of precognition is when they have a thought or they have an idea and it manifests itself. But it turns out that the manifestation of that desire existed as a precondition. So the real question here is the manifestation of the desire really a manifestation or a set of precondition? This is a mere introduction to mental disorder, atypical people. All individuals who are outside the neurotypical spectrum, they fall into this area of impulsivity, distractibility, disinhibition, grandiosity, and pathological compulsion. There's this sort of misconception, misapprehension, or misconstrue of individuals who are perceived as weird or eccentric or abnormal. It is not that we are what you perceive us to be. We are actually high functioning. We actually function cognitively on a very high level. And sometimes that high cognition or that high, I am high functioning or autistic. I have a difficult time interacting and engaging conversation that I simply don't find intriguing. I would much rather discuss light and the electromagnetic spectrum. I would much rather discuss quantum electrodynamics, the relationship between photons and electrons. When you study quantum electrodynamics, the relationship between electrons and photons, what you see is something extraordinary. You see a lot of sociology. You see a lot of sociology. Energy, subatomic particles cancel each other out, and it's based on energy level. Who energy level determines if there's going to be a camaraderie, whether there's going to be an absorption, whether there's going to be a transmission, and it's quite an intriguing phenomenon. So your misperception of individuals like myself, atypical, or people who fall within any sort of the outside the realm of what society perceives us as normal. It is not that we are normal, right? We function on a level that is sort of above average. And the average person have a huge contention with that. And one of the fascinating factors of high functioning autism is we tend to delve deep into areas that we have a very narrow interest. We have a very, very narrow interest. If we study in the electromagnetic spectrum, we may just study one frequency only. We might just have an infatuation with ultraviolet, or just infrared, or just gamma radiation, or X-ray. One of my biggest fascination in music is octaves. Another big fascination I had was psychophysics, which is the relationship between physical stimulation and mental phenomenon. How I derived to psychophysics and psychoacoustics also. How I ended up in psychophysics and psychoacoustics was while studying music, writing, composing, arranging, transposing, and transcribing music. I couldn't understand why a musician and a non-musician would hear the exact same sus4 and sus2 chord and have the same emotional attribute. I found that fascinating. And this is why I delved into psychophysics, the relationship between physical stimulation and mental phenomenon. These things are sort of esoteric. It's sort of isolated. You can't walk around to any random person and say, hey, you want to discuss semantic ambiguity? Let's discuss homonym, homophone, homograph, heteronym, heterograph, polysemy, monosemy, capitonym, paronym, hyphonym, meronym, holonym, or hyphonym. Let's discuss the difference between verbal irony and verbal sarcasm. Let's discuss dramatic, situational, verbal, tragic, and Socratic irony. At one time, I had a deep-seated infatuation with how people use situational irony and coincidences interchangeably and out of context. Situational irony is a contrast of what's expected or anticipated. Coincidences is when there's a correlation between mutually exclusive events or scenario. They are a shared disparity. They share no commonality whatsoever. I find these things infatuated. Verbal irony? Verbal irony is the contrast of what's expected or anticipated. It's a literal statement that has a contrasted interpretation that derives from the tone. And you have verbal sarcasm, which is disparaging, which is despondent, which is sinister, which is malevolent. And then you have verbal irony, which is innocuous, which is friendly, which is benevolent. There's a clear distinction. Verbal irony and verbal sarcasm are misconstrued, used interchangeably and out of context. And these are the things we find intriguing. But we are misunderstood. We are misunderstood. You know, atypical people are profound. We are profound. We are fascinated. And the problem here is, for Halloween, everyone becomes us. For Halloween, you want to do a true psychological study on the masses. Basically, what is normalism? Normalism is basically things that fall within the unanimous consensus. There's a unanimous consensus. Things fall within the unanimous consensus. It constitutes normalism. Here's a fantastic situational irony. If you'd like to do a psychological study, Halloween. Who or whatever a person is germinates during Halloween. If a guy is a geek for Halloween, most likely he's going to dress up like James Bond or Clint Eastwood, because his deep-seated desire, deep within his psyche, he desires to become that alpha male. Everyone becomes atypical for Halloween. But if you dress up as a costume the day before or the day after Halloween, you are considered abnormal. You are considered eccentric. I find it quite unfortunate that I have to come here and justify myself to a group of people that I truly, and I don't mean this in a condescending manner, a group of people that I deem irrelevant, because I don't think my objective should be centered around impressing people who I don't see as have any relevance to my growth in life. My emphasis is primarily centered around people who see me for who I am as an individual, which is a profound, a prolific, and an abnormal person, but in quite an extraordinary and an intriguing way. And I think it's unfortunate that normal people who make up the unanimous consensus get to be the driving focal point in this world to determine who I am as an individual in a sort of pessimistic way. And that's unfortunate. I think that's truly unfortunate. Thank you very much.